Well, our speaker, as you probably know, is Dr. Helen Howe, who has a number of attributes to her name, including being a qualified mountain leader, taking courses up in the Cairngorms, as well as being an experienced geography tutor. It says here that she's passionate about the UK mountain environment, which is probably a good thing, although scientifically speaking, I'm not sure about that, but sounds interesting anyway. We're very grateful that she's coming to talk to us about the geomorphology of the Cairngorms, which I don't think we've had talked about, certainly not in those terms before. And she has a slideshow all prepared for us. We'll be speaking for, I think, 45 minutes or so, and then we'll be happy to take questions either then and there or as accumulated through chat, as Donald had said. So, Helen, if you're ready to go, go.
Yep. So it is actually about Scotland or the Scottish Highlands rather than just the Cairngorms. And do shout at me if I run over, because, yeah, I do get a bit passionate about the geomorphology of the UK mountains. So, yeah, I might overrun slightly. So I'm just going to share my screen with you all. Is that showing for everyone?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, fantastic.
Fine.
So I've called this Landscape Detectives, and the idea behind Landscape Detectives is I think sometimes you don't know completely what has formed or why things have formed. You can make sort of theoretical guesses and judgment guesses, but sometimes, like a detective, you may actually get it wrong. You're just going off the theory you know and applying it to what you see. So this is really a whistle-top tour of the landforms of the Scottish Highlands. So let's see, slideshow. Great, here we go. So what's my background? Well, I've got a geography degree from Durham University. I'm not actually a doctor. I haven't even done a PhD. I am just a real enthusiast to do with the landscapes and landforms. And geomorphology was really my passion at university. I taught at Clitheroe Grammar from 1993 to 2006, teaching sixth form as well as the rest of the years. And I was lucky that I was actually allowed to just totally focus on the physical geography side, because I'm afraid human geography, unless it links across to the outdoor environment, something like applied geomorphology and so on, doesn't really interest me. I was a senior tutor for the Field Studies Council at Ridley Creagh at Battersea Coed from 2006 to 2011, which meant I took my passion outside. So instead of teaching geography or glaciation and coast indoors, I was out using places like Coo Midwell, Prickearth, Mignant Moor, etc. as my classroom. And then I left and set up Snowdonia First Aid and Snowdonia Mountain Skills with my husband. And we run first aid courses, mountain leader courses, mountain skills, winter skills, etc. In lockdown, when I was getting very, very frustrated because the Welsh lockdown was actually very, very strict. We weren't allowed to drive anywhere. We weren't allowed to go from our towns or villages. And at the beginning of lockdown, the National Park were asked where were their busiest mountains. And unfortunately, living in Llanberis, Snowdon was closed and the whole of the Glidders were closed. So whereas people on the other side of the Glidder Mountains, the Glidderai, were able to go all over the Carnithai, which were considered to be nice, quiet mountains, all our mountains locally were closed. So it was very frustrating. So I started, there was one mountain I could really go up every time and every day once it was open, and that was Elidavour. And it actually opened my eyes to things I've walked past for years and years, even as a geographer and a geomorphologist, and just never even really noticed. And what jumped out at me more than anything was the periglacial landforms, which are quite small, and everyone focuses on the glacial landforms, which are a lot larger. And I just kept spotting things that I thought, oh, wow, I'm looking at solifluction lobe, I'm looking at stone stripes, stone polygons, solifluction sheets, etc. And that gave me the idea that a guy called Mike Rain had written The Nature of Snowdonia, which has become the Mountain Leader Environmental Handbook. And another guy, Kev Walker, decided he would do one for the Brecon Beacons. And I wanted to do a very general one for the whole of the UK. And Franco from Pez de Press basically said, no, I've already got 2 regions and I've got someone else writing the Lake District and the Yorkshire Dales. So it's got to fit into this stable. And it was like, bingo, here's my excuse, right? Scottish Highlands, here I come, which meant I was actually able to travel slightly in some of our lockdowns because it was work. But Steve and I live in a camper van when we're away and keep away from people, being quite antisocial that way. I then set up the Landscape Detectives Workshop for the Mountain Training Association, who oversee things like the association links with the Mountain Leader, Lowland Leader, Highland, Hill and Moorland Leaders. And I've run some in Wales, but I've also run 2 in the Cairngorms. And I'm hoping in the next year to expand across. I'm looking at Culmore. I'm looking at some of the mountains in Assynt, which have some of the best periglacial features going. So hopefully I'm going to expand my repertoire there, but open it to more people than just the MTA. I'm a summer, winter and international mountain leader, and I've had a long love of the Scottish Highlands and mountains and highlands. I've completed all the Munros. I'm 4 Corbetts short. I was before lockdown. And then after lockdown, I'm still 4 Corbetts short because I've got an ancient old dog. The dog you can see on the photograph here, she hit 13 in the first year of lockdown. And Steve and I want to do some of those Corbetts together, especially our last one. So at the moment, we take it in turns. We have what's called a Clooney Day, which is one of us stays with Clooney and gives her low-level walks and lots of love and fuss, while the other has a mountain day with the young dog. So that's my background to all of this. And yep, Ken's right. I am passionate about the mountains and the geomorphology of the mountains. So looking at the Scottish Highlands, there are several things which influence what we see, the landforms. One of those things is geology, and the different types of rock, the different structures of rock, whether it is some massive structure like the Moyne Thrust around Inchinadam, or whether it is smaller structures like the dikes where you've had volcanic eruptions underground and the lava's been splitting through other types of landforms. Obviously, we've got glaciation, and that's the thing people tend to think of when they look at Scotland. You see the glacial landscapes, they leap out at you. And in particular, the Ice Age, the Loch Lomond Re-Advance, which was around 11,000 to 10,000 years ago, nothing like as big in England and Wales. In England and Wales, we got little valley, well, 1 or 2 little valley glaciers, but they tended to be corrie glaciers, what we call niche glaciers. Whereas up in Scotland, they had a whole ice cap which covered the Western Highlands. Another influence on the landscape is periglaciation, and that's taking place even today. Peri literally means on the edge of, and then glaciation. So you might think, well, how on earth can we call it periglaciation in Scotland at present? But I remember when I was growing up, going to a talk, and this was in the 1980s, where we were told that if the temperature dropped by about 1 degree, and that was in the 80s, now it'd probably be 2.5 or so, we would be back to glaciers forming in Scotland and possibly even in the Lake District if we drop by 2 degrees C. So we are almost a glacial landscape. And at the same time, one of the big things with periglaciation is freeze-thaw. Because we still have cold temperatures, and we've seen it so much this winter, from freezing one day to thawing the next, freezing again, etc. I had a quick look at the MWIS forecast for the Cairngorms because we're heading back up to Scotland tomorrow, and the temperatures are forecast to be above freezing on the tops again. So in one season, we can have over 100 freeze-thaw cycles in the Scottish mountains. So periglaciation is ongoing. It was going on in the Ice Age, where the highest mountains peaked up over the ice caps and the glaciers, but it's still going on today as well. We also have water and ice, which will influence what we see as mass movement. So the big scree slopes, the debris flows, the mud flows, which from time to time block the roads. And then also the wind. Scotland has some incredible wind speeds. I can't remember the highest recorded at Cairngorm, but I think it was well over 150, 180 miles an hour. And that wind has huge amounts of power, and it can shift things around on the mountaintops. And as a result, some of the landforms that we actually see on the mountains are influenced or partially created by the wind, along with other things. So looking at geology, what have we got? Well, we've got the bedrock, different types of bedrock. So it could be granite, a nice form of granite up here. You've got gneiss, which you see up in the northwest Highlands, which is actually Britain's oldest rock that we have. Anyone who walks in Skye will be aware of the gabbro, that hard rock, which completely wears boots away. Go up to Torridon, we've got Torridonian sandstone, again, one of the older rocks in the UK, a fantastic dune bedding and cross bedding that you can see on there. Go to other areas, you get the schist with this fantastic flow banding that you can see, where it's been twisted and contorted when we've had other sort of massive earth movements like the Caledonian orogeny. And the word orogeny literally means mountain building, orogenesis, the beginning of the mountains. So the Caledonian orogeny, a lot of the old rocks were then subjected to pressure and heat. And as a result, you end up with all this sort of flow banding, beautiful sort of patterns in the rock. We've got the structures we talked about. So things like intrusive volcanicity, where instead of erupting onto the Earth's surface, volcanoes can erupt through the Earth's surface. And one of the classic examples of that is from Ardnamurchan, where you've got the windsill, one of the dikes which traveled, or in fact, in this case, a sill rather than a dike, which traveled all the way across, taking in parts of Hadrian's Wall, or creating the land where Hadrian's Wall is, and into Northumbria with the castles of Northumbria, places like Bamborough, Craster, etc., sitting high on windsill cliffs, which originated all the way from Ardnamurchan. So we've got these huge earth movements. We've also got bigger earth movements where plate tectonics have moved continents around the world. And in fact, Scotland's made up of 6 different continents, which have all ended up joined together through the eons of time. And then volcanicity, you know, if you go to somewhere like Edinburgh, you've got a crag and tail where you've had the plug of an old volcano. And then when the glaciers have traveled around it, they've been unable to erode the material, the softer rock, which is protected behind it. So lots and lots of structure going on. Glaciation, the really obvious thing. And we tend to think of glaciation, I suppose, when we see places like the Cairngorms, we go, wow, that is so glaciated. Now, I don't know about you, but on my screen, can I get rid of it? I don't know if you've got the problem that I had there, where you could actually see a whole load of people there. That's better. So you see the Cairngorms, and you see the classic U-shaped valleys or glacial troughs. And then you move over to the west and you see mountains poking up, and sometimes not quite as obvious glacial features. But in fact, the west has had a lot of its glacial features removed, and it's been eroded far more than the Cairngorms, because it was subject to the Loch Lomond re-advance. And as a result, we get this Loch and Nochan type of countryside or terrain, where you can see all these low mounds and then small little lochans. So types of glacial landforms, you've got erosional, you've got depositional, where you've got moraines, you've got fluvio-glacial. And again, I've got really into the fluvio-glacial. So we all probably know about glacial troughs, or U-shaped valleys, the common name for them, corries, arêtes, pyramidal peaks, which you don't really see in the Cairngorms to the same extent as other areas, because you haven't had the same amount of erosion cutting back into the mountains. But then you've got fantastic depositional landforms. And you can see on the left here, that's the boulder clay, which underlies, or the glacial till, which underlies a lot of the landscape in Scotland. Our top left photograph of the 4 shows a fantastic series of recessional moraines, and each of those is a terminal moraine. It's where the snout of the glaciers reach to, and then it's retreated, and then it's built up another recessional terminal moraine, and you can see the same location but a different view of these fantastic recessional moraines. If anyone's been to Torridon, you probably know the Corrie of 1,000 Hills. And again, there you've got loads and loads of lots of different recessional moraines, but much more hummocky because the glacier is not retreated in the same sort of fits and starts that it did for those other recessional moraines. And then down below Foynathan, you've got these fantastic lateral moraines that you can see running along this valley as glaciers have got smaller and smaller. Fluvioglacial, all that ice, which in places was over a kilometre deep, has to melt. And as it melts, it can do 2 things. One thing is it can erode. And so places like the Cairngorms, there are quite a lot of fluvioglacial meltwater channels. So one like Dirkvor underneath the Farra, and then a lot of these others which run down, cutting through mountain ridges, lower parts of the spurs of mountain ridges in the Cairngorms. This is up above Glenfeshie. And then you've also got deposition. So this feature in the top photograph there is what we call a cane terrace. And that's where you've had a massive glacier or ice cap. And then as it's melted along the sides, sediment has built up, and then the glacier is finally melted away, and it's left this feature, this step in the landscape. You can see about 3 of these if you go up towards the ski car park area. And cames, unlike the moraine that we saw before, where it's that very jumbled material, and the name boulder clay is very apt, it's a mixture of boulders and clay. Cames tend to be a lot more sorted because it's actually formed by water, and water sorts material according to size. So some cames can be very, very sandy, others can be layers of silts and gravels and smaller cobbles and pebbles. But when you look at them, what you'll find is they tend to be very rounded material because they've had the attrition from the meltwater. Whereas if I can, whoops, nope, it's not going to let me go back. I was going to say if I could go back, you could have seen the jumbled picture. Now I seem to have jammed. Here we go. There. So periglaciation, this is the one which has really grabbed me over the last 2 years or so. And so this is what I'm focusing most on tonight, because it might open your eyes to things that you may have noticed, but you've never really known why they formed, or you may have just not noticed the landforms. So we said periglacial literally means on the edge of glacier, and it's usually associated with permafrost. In other words, where the ground is frozen, and every year you get an active layer on the surface, what we call, the active layer, which is like sludge, because permafrost ground is completely impermeable. So when the top layer, the active layer melts, the water has nowhere to go. It can't drain through the rock or through the soil. So it turns the surface like a mush or a sludge. And you get a process called solifluction and also gelifluction. In Scotland, we don't really have that permafrost. They do in the Alps, but in Scotland, usually all the land does thaw out. But our big influence in present-day Scotland are these freeze-thaw cycles, where you may have literally 100 freeze-thaw cycles through a year, because you think all the way through autumn and spring, even in summer, sometimes temperatures get down to minus figures. Now in Scotland, we can actually see 2 main types of periglacial features. We can see relic ones. These tend to be much larger, and they have thousands of years to form above the ice sheets. And they were found on the top mountain summits. And they are big features because the freeze-thaw processes and the permafrost were much more active than they are nowadays, in the sense of there was more freezing, stronger freezing going on, and therefore bigger stones and so on were able to be moved. Nowadays, we have smaller smaller periglacial features because the processes aren't quite as strong as they were. But yeah, on the edge of glacier, here we go. This is the Cairngorm Plateau last July, and we still have snowbanks. Some years the snow can actually last in some of these areas, what we call nivation hollows, all year without melting. And one of the things which is really responsible for a lot of these features that we're going to look at are these little things called pipcrakes, and they're where ice needles form and they push the top layer of soil, but they also push stones, and they can push fairly substantial stones up into the air. You may actually have seen them, and sometimes you can get several days growth on pipcrakes. So you may see 5 stacked up on top of each other. So what sort of periglacial processes do we get? Well, we get frost action. What people call freeze-thaw, technically in geography or geomorphology, we call frost action, because freeze-thaw just describes the whole cycle of freezing and thawing each night. Frost action is the one where water enters rocks, freezes and expands and causes them to fall apart. We also have frost heave, which is based on these pipcrakes, which are able to heave rocks and stones up into the air, and then they fall back down, but they fall down according to gravity rather than pushing straight up. We have frost creep, we have solifluction, gelifluction, and then we also have wind erosion deposition, which is mixed in with some of these processes to create the landforms we see. So loads and loads of different landforms. You'll all be aware of scree slopes and talus. We see it all the time. Felsenmeer, that's what we also call block fields, again, on the summits of the mountains, very blocky landscapes. We can get this pattern ground, amazing pattern ground, where you can actually see patterns in the rocks and the stones on the ground. So things that are formed by that are stone polygons or sorted stone circles, elongated polygons, stone stripes, stone bank terraces, pattern vegetation. And then we also get the solifluction lobes and sheets, and another fantastic feature, the ploughing boulders. So frost action or freeze thaw, it's also sometimes called frost wedging. And water enters a rock, it enters cracks in the rock, it freezes, and as it freezes, it expands by around 10%, to be exactly precise, 9.8%. But that's able to push the rock and put pressure on the rock. If that happens enough times, freezing, thawing, over time, it will break up the rock by making these cracks larger and larger. And there are 2 main landforms that we get from this. One are the block fields of Felsenmeer, and Felsenmeer is the German literally for field, or sorry, sea of rocks. So this is out on Foinaben, and you can see it's a complete sea of rocks, a jumble of rocks, where those rocks are being broken down in situ, and because they're on a flat surface, they're not going anywhere. They just break up where they are and they stay there. And they can make pretty nightmarish walking in some locations. If it happens on a slope, then you get scree or talus. So this is on Skye, and you can just see the huge amounts of broken rock, which is fragmented from the freeze thaw action above. So there you go, another example of Felsenmeer, flat surfaces, mountain plateaus and ridges, and then scree slopes, which some can be in these amazing sort of triangular shapes, or they sometimes can occur across the whole valley side if you've got fairly uniform crags. One thing which sometimes you may notice, it's not as apparent on this one, but sometimes on scree slopes, you can get a certain amount of grading of material. And it's based off the fact that the larger rocks are heavier and therefore they have more energy. So they build up at the bottom, they can travel further. And the smaller rocks and stones tend to accumulate higher up the scree slope. So it's worth looking out for that. Frost heave, as we said, it's based off pipcrakes and these little ice needles which form underneath stones. So in a soil, the stone tends to cool down much quicker than the watery matrix that it's set in. And as a result, it attracts the cold and the water in contact with it turns to ice. And so you get these ice needles which grow underneath it and push the stone or the surface outwards. And then, as you can see, it tends to grow out perpendicular from the slope. So there's a slight angle on that. When that melts, the rock will then just fall back straight vertically down to the slope again. So gradually we get this frost creep where these materials are moved further and further down the hillside. Every single freeze-thaw cycle, they shift a little bit further and a little bit further. And they also think some of these stones are brought to the surface by quite a complicated procedure called frost pull. But again, it's just where the stone cools down quicker in winter, but in summer it heats up, it gets the heat from the surface, so it then melts the stuff beneath it, etc. But all these processes then lead to all these fantastic types of pattern ground. So this photograph here is on Ben Uren in Assynt, Ben Uren, which is one of my favourite mountains. I have tried, once I knew it had periglacial features, which I saw in the Royal Geographical Society book, I was determined to get there. My first attempt, I was thwarted by blizzards, which, to be fair, I just wouldn't have seen anything. You've got to have good weather. But then I got back there last summer and I was absolutely blown away. This is what we call a stone garland. So a stone garland is where you've just got like a net of these fantastic sorted polygons. And what happens is the stones get heaved to the surface by the frost pull and frost heave. And then by the process of frost creep, they then fall down the sides until they then build up into these circular or polygon shapes. So relic stone polygons, you can tell a relic stone rather than a current one because it was formed thousands of years ago. And as a result, the center of this polygon is soil type material and it's been able to grass over. Now, right on the summit area of Ben Uren, I was gobsmacked to find these fantastic little tiny stone polygons or sorted stone circles. And you can actually see the formation there. They're much smaller. These stones were probably about 5 to 10 centimeters, whereas some of these on the relic were massive, as in 0.5 meter or 1 meter in size. But so you can see the difference of sizing, but you can also see this very, very fine material here in the center, and then the stones have been pushed down or moved outwards to create these little polygons. And it looks like just disturbed ground. You certainly see these orange centers where the minerals are being pushed back up to the surface, and they're non-vegetated, a lot of them, because it's current, it's happening right now. It's probably well, maybe not tonight, but depending on how cold it is on Ben Uren tonight, there may be a bit more going on. Now, we talked about the idea that if you have a permafrost, the ground underneath is impermeable. And so the surface layer, what we call the active layer, turns to mush. Now, we don't have that permafrost really in Scotland anymore, but what we do have is a lot of impermeable rock and very shallow soils. And so you get the same effect. And gelifluction is where the freezing and the actual permafrost is involved. Solifluction is soil fluction or soil movement. And that's more down to the fact that you've got the impermeable rock and it moves the soil downhill. And it can happen at even fairly minuscule gradients of slope. Even 4 degrees gradient can actually shift a lot of soil. And so as a result, if you've got a stone polygon which is formed, but it's forming on a slight slope, then they get elongated. I'm afraid these aren't very good photos of elongated polygons. You can just about see it's being elongated in that direction. And again, sort of from side to side on the photograph. If you get steeper slopes where generally it's over about 6 to 8 degrees, then rather than having stone polygons, you can get these incredible stone stripes. I'm afraid this photograph on the right isn't taken from Scotland. It's from one of the mountains, Igan, which is in Snowdonia, but it was a really good example of these stone stripes with about 1 metre of vegetation in between. So in other words, those stone polygons have just really got stretched out by the solifluction which is going on. You can get solifluction lobes. So here you can see these incredible sort of tongue shapes. You can see that there's a lower layer, then there's a higher layer above them. And so season by season, you'll get these solifluction lobes, tongues of soil which flow downhill, and they bring the material with them. If you've got a fairly even surface where it's not as the actual terrain is a bit more even, then you can get sheets instead. So this one, I think, was Benacastel. I think it's Castel. It's at the bottom end of Glascarnach, and you can see it's a sheet rather than a lobe. And this sheet, what we call the riser of the sheet, stretches for over 100 meters or so. So very, very different shape, but exactly the same process forming it. And again, some more big solifluction lobes here, but with what we call stone banked terraces or stone banked solifluction lobes. And as it says on the PowerPoint, you've got the solifluction moving the soil downhill. Some of the rocks get carried with it, but at the same time, you've got frost heave and creep, which then moves the larger rocks even faster. So they overtake, and then they just topple off the end and they build up a bank at the end, or a terrace of stone. Now, another fantastic landform that you can find in Scotland, and often we ignore them, are these things called ploughing boulders. And so that's, I think it's John here standing by a fantastic ploughing boulder in the Cairngorms. And you can see above it, there's a trench, and below it, it's not actually a fantastic push-up zone in front of it. But what happens is, this is in the solifluction slope, but at the same time, being a big rock, it attracts the cold and it attracts the heat. It warms up and cools down much more quickly and to a greater extent than the soil. So as a result, it sort of pulls ice crystals, water in the soil is pulled against it, it freezes, and then in the summer it melts and the rock sort of collapses forwards. And you can see these lovely pressure ridges. This was actually in Corrie Raybert, at the back of Cairngorm. And you can see these lovely pressure ridges, and you can just about make out a bit of a trench behind it, not a very good one. Some are very pronounced trenches, others aren't so. But if you go out in the mountains, quite often you may notice behind a rock, which is on even a slight slope, it seems quite a lot of them have a crack. And that's the beginning of this ploughing process. And some move faster than others. It depends on the gradient. It depends on how many freeze-thaw cycles and all sorts of things. And so that's sort of the periglacial features. What else have we got going on? Well, we've got aeolian, in other words, wind. And Scottish mountain ridges are incredibly windy places. We also have a prevailing wind direction. In the UK, our wind for more days than anything else comes from the southwest. And that often means it gets tunneled or channeled through places like the Bealachs and over shoulders. And so that can then affect landforms. So one type of landform you can see as the result of the wind are what we call deflation surfaces. So this one here, both of these photos are taken from Culmore up in Assynt. And as the Torridonian sandstone has been weathered away by the rain and all sorts of things, the acidity in the rain and so on, some of the minerals being dissolved, you've got a surface where you've got the larger bits, but you've also got the finer material. And the finer material gets blown away and it will end up building up into sort of dune-like features. So here's one of our little dogs, Meggie, sitting in one of the bialachs up on Culmore, with a fantastic example of where all that loose sand has got blown to. And then again, it's getting eroded again, and it will get blown somewhere else. So as a result of this, you can get pattern vegetation, you can get deflation surfaces, stone bank terraces, which I'll show you in a minute, and these dune-like processes. So pattern vegetation, again, something you rarely see in England or Wales. It seems to be a big feature of Scottish mountains. So this is one of the Corbetts, Benenard or Benavard, near Strathfarrar. And this is on one of the ridges coming up from Glenfeshie. But what you get is ridges, almost like dune features, and where often they have very symmetrical wind or very uniform wave crests. So the distance between each of these often is very, very similar. So it's where material is getting moved, dumped on the other side, and over time it will keep getting moved and then moved again and moved again. So that's your pattern vegetation. You can get these incredible stone bank terraces. So especially the place I've tended to see these more than anywhere, I think, at Assynt. So Slioch, this is coming down, this left-hand photograph coming down the shoulder off Slioch. And you can see these incredible steps in the landscape where you've got what we call a tread, and then you've got a riser. And the tread is this loose material, stony material, and then you've got a vegetation riser and then another tread. And when you look downhill, same spot looking downhill, you can make out loads and loads of them, just like a staircase going up the mountain. There's at least 10 in a row in that location. So Slioch, fantastic examples. Antielach, around the back of Antielach, there's a lot. Culmore, again, quite a few on Culmore. These are the Culmore ones. Skirnidlet, again, quite a few impressive ones going up from the Bialach there. So why do they form? Well, they are partly down to solifluction. We're pretty sure solifluction has a part to play in them. But at the same time, one of the interesting things with a lot of these stone bank terraces is that they aren't perfect. They don't perfectly contour across the slope. A lot of them are on a slight gradient, so they're rising up in one direction. So we think it is a mixture of the wind, because they are certainly most obvious where you've got very, very exposed slopes and where a prevailing wind is going to be dominant on that slope. So we certainly think there's a bit of solifluction going on, and we also think there is definitely wind erosion going on with these. But again, it's one of those not very well explained things. No one's totally sure exactly what's going on. Now, the other thing we've got in Scotland is the big mass movements. And you'll remember times when roads have been closed. I think it was the A84 when I was a younger adult, let's say. I remember sneaking in to look at the road closure and the incredible landslides there. But mass movements, there are various different types. You can have huge rock falls or landslips. And so this is one of the famous ones. This is on Ben Alligan. And this whole landscape, the landscape or the original surface would have just gone straight across there and again across there. So huge amounts of rock, which have collapsed off the mountain. And if you've been into the quarry below down here, the old quarry of the Wolf, you can see the massive rock boulders, which are a result from that one catastrophic sort of huge rockfall. Similar thing on Bushfen in Torridon. Bushfen has got another big rockfall on it with quite a big ridge built up below it. This is a much more modern one. This is coming down to Loch Brandy. And again, you can see the area the rock has gone and then it's collapsed down below it. And you can't see quite as much of it. There have been quite a few on Loch Nagar over the last 10, 20 years. This one's not technically, it's not a rockfall or a slip, but it's a good example of one of the, when you've got the boulder clay building up, or it's been built up and then it's got a solid rock surface underneath, it can slide on that rock surface. So up here, you've got all these tension cracks appearing as the ground has got very, very wet and saturated, making it heavy. And at this point, it's actually gone. So that section's had a collapse on the bottom right. But you can see where at some point that is also going to collapse. And when you get this type of mass movement, they leave you with a crown wall, a bit like you have with an avalanche crown wall. We also have rotational slips or slumps, and probably the most famous of those has got to be over at the Curragh on the Isle of Skye, where things like this, the Old Manor Store, would have been up here as well. It would have been the same height, starting up here, and it's slumping down. You've got all these big rotational slumps in the old lava fields. They can be huge, they can be minute. This one over here, I'm trying to remember where I took that photo. I think that was last summer around Glen Affric. And again, lots and lots of more little rotational slips, but still quite significant, but nothing like the size of the Curragh. All the way to these little terracettes on a hillside, which literally may only be a foot high, and have a riser which is only about half a foot in size. And then debris flows all over Scotland, but some places more than others. The Larry Grew, if you've ever walked through the Larry Grew, you will see debris flow after debris flow all the way down. And again, this one here, you've got Arkle with massive debris flows. And again, you can tell the ages of them according to the colour of the rock on them, how vegetated they are, and also fresh debris flows, much lighter colours running through it. So where is good to have a look at these locations? Well, the three places I picked out, and I'm not saying there aren't other good places, there definitely are. I should have put Skye in there. And, you know, Central Highlands as well has Southern Highlands, etc. They've got a lot of good features. But the places which have really stood out to me over the last 2 years are the Cairngorms. I found sorted polygons and stone polygons above Glenfeshie, not quite as good as the ones on Ben and Uren, but they've certainly been good. And the Cairngorms, ploughing boulders in the Cairngorms, great place for them, and debris flows. Assington, Sutherland, again, a lot of mountains there, a place like Culmore, Ben and Uren, and Slioch, etc. And then Torridon as well. A lot of the periglacial features and the wind type features can be found in Torridon. So I hope that's sort of given you a bit of a wider insight into some of the landforms. And I've by no means covered all of them, because there are so many different landforms out there. But it might just give you something to go out and think, yeah, that's what she was talking about. It's a Came terrace, or, oh, look, I can find some polygons.
Well, thank you very much for that. I think Ken will come back in, but we can invite people to put questions into the chat. You've given us lots to look out for there. It's hard at times to realize that some of the things you describe are actually a natural occurrence, because some of the terracing and the polygons almost look as though they're man-made.
Right, well, I think there's some questions coming in by chat, so the more the merrier. I think I started one off myself. How is a lip formed? Many of our Cairngorm corries have a lochen in them. And I mean, I can understand how the glaciers and the rock has slipped away to the northeast usually. But how is the actual lip formed to hold in the water?
So actually, if I answer the question after that, the rotational slide or slip, that might help, because rotational slides and slips work in a very similar way to how a glacier slips. And I am not a physicist, so this is not going to be a fantastic explanation. But if I have my hands like that with rotational slides, they have a pivot point. So if you think of my finger as being the pivot point, rock and ice will do that sort of movement. And so in a corrie, the glacier slides like that. And so at this point, it's actually at its deepest. And so we get what we call over deepening. And then at that point, it's actually become less deep again. And so there's less erosion on the actual lip of the corrie, which then gives rise to that corrie lip. And it's very similar to rotational slide. Again, you get these pivot points, which, like I said, I'm not a physicist, so I can't explain them fully. But yeah, you just have to bear with me. And yeah, we have these pivot points, and therefore you get this rotational movement down the hillside. But the other thing with glaciers is once you've got this rotational pivoting going, the analogy I use is a bit like a slinky. So if any of you have ever had a slinky, you know how slinkies move like this. Once they start, they keep going almost on the same frequency. And a glacier does the same. And because of this sort of frequency of it keeps getting over deep and less deep and over deep and less deep, you get what we call extension or compressive flow. So where a glacier ends up extending, it becomes thinner, and so it can't erode as deeply. And then when it compresses and builds up, it then it erodes a lot more deeply, because the main thing which dictates how glaciers erode or how much they erode is the thickness or the depth of that glacier. And so that's why when you look at the course of a glacier, if you follow right from a mountain corrie all the way down to the sea, you get steep back wall and then gentle or almost flat base of corrie. Then it goes over the corrie lip down to the valley floor, and then it goes flat again, and then you'll find another rock step, and then it drops down quite steeply, and then it becomes fairly flat again, etc. So you just get this repetition of steep, flat, because of this compressive extending flow. And again, one of my analogies for explaining that flow is think of how a worm moves. So when worms move, they stretch themselves out and become thin, and then they bunch themselves up and become really thick, and then they squish them and they squeeze themselves out again. So a glacier moves a bit like a worm in that sort of extending, compressing, extending, compressing.
Okay,
does that help a bit?
Well, I never thought as a glacier as a slinky worm, but I'll think about it. A couple more questions coming up in the chat of perhaps more current relevance, and you may or may not be able to comment on this. I don't know if you can read it, but one asks about the structural failures in the Cairngorm funicular, where support pillars have rotated because they're not all fixed to bedrock. Have you any comments?
It would totally make sense, because you have got constantly moving rock. If you look at the hillside, certainly if you go around to Corrie Keist, the other side, and you walk across the hillside, or you look back into Corrie Keist towards the whole ski area, you can see lots and lots of solifluction lobes on that hillside and solifluction terraces. So that doesn't surprise me one bit, because you, like I said, you're dealing with a periglacial environment. And if we were building the structures like they do in the Arctic, then people take that sort of thing into account. You either put the structures, the foundation structures go right into the permafrost, so the landscape moves around, but that structure is fixed. Or they try and protect it in some way. So that definitely does make sense. I didn't know that was what had happened to them, but yeah, I would agree there.
Right, thank you. And another one asks, or points out that some scientists have suggested there were still glaciers in the Cairngorms in the 18th century. Can you tell us how old the last glaciers were?
I can't tell you how old they are, but I would definitely agree that there almost certainly were, because we've always talked about something called the Little Ice Age. So if you go back to the 1800s and Charles Dickens, he writes about frost fairs on the River Thames. And we know that the climate was so cold in the 1800s that Eskimos were seen canoeing off the coast of Scotland because they got forced further south by much greater extents of sea ice in the Arctic. And like I said, go back to the 80s, we were saying that you only needed a drop of about 2 degrees C for glaciers to form in the next 10 years. And we thought that was going to happen until climate change and global warming kicked in. If you got a cooling in the climate in the UK, we would probably only need 50 years for full glaciers to be, or for glaciers to be formed in corries and to start moving out of those corries, because we have such a wet climate in the UK. So maybe not in the Cairngorms, that's a bit slightly more arid climate or semi-arid. But if you went to the west, where you're looking at 3,000 millimeters of rainfall per year, if a lot of that was falling in the mountains as snow, then certainly it would only take about 50 years for glaciers. So to me, yeah, I would definitely agree. There were probably small glaciers in some of those higher corries.
Yes, of course, Dickens that's 19th century, I suppose. The question refers to 18th century. And then, was it Samuel Pepys talked about the Thames freezing over in the 17th century, I guess.
Yeah.
So there's a few centuries to play around with here. But I mean, we're all talking practically yesterday by geological terms, I suppose.
Yeah. And I mean, if you look at the way the climate's fluctuated, Roman times, it was so warm, they have vineyards in the north of England, which I think, if memory serves me, I think there are now vineyards near York again. But then you go several years on, or several centuries on, and certainly quite a few of the medieval townships up on Dartmoor were deserted in the medieval times. And yes, you could argue some of that might have been the Black Death, but at the same time, it would suggest the climate wasn't as good for growing crops anymore. So people got forced down out of those areas.
Right. There's another one just come up from Jay. Is your ascent mountain with good periglacial features the Ben of Huron north of Conneval?
Yeah.
Is that the hill?
Yeah, it's the Conneval and Benmore ascent one. Yes. And it's a cracking mountain. If you ever go up, it's worth going up. There's a glen almost after you leave the Inchendam Field Centre. There's a glen which goes up, and it's Britain's in the sort of wide hanging valley at the top before you sort of get up to these glacial features. It's Britain's only true war grave. There's a memorial up there to, oh gosh, can't remember which type of aircraft, but one of the aircraft crashed in the war, and they weren't found for a long time because it was in a blizzard. And in the end, they buried the airmen up there rather than bringing them down. It's the only place in the UK that's happened, and it is a very, very poignant but beautiful location.
Ascent reminds me that I forget the name of the two famous geologists who were up there 200 years ago. They were, I imagine, mainly interested in the rock types. So when were these other processes that you've been talking about, when were they discovered and determined? I mean, relatively recently or late 19th century? Or?
Oh, pass. I don't honestly know. I mean, all I can say is put it this way. Oh, crumbs, what's his name? Darwin actually kicked himself because he'd gone to Cwm Idwal in Wales. And he came back to Cwm Idwal later, and it was another geologist, geomorphologist called Charles Sedgwick, who actually associated Cwm Idwal with the glacial features that you see in the Alps. And he sort of said to himself, oh, you know, if you put a bit of snow and ice in there, that would actually look like that, the cirque that you see in the Alps. So he made the connection with the UK having the glacial processes. So really, as far as the glacial processes go, it is only the 1800s onwards that we realised that we had glaciers in the UK. Just like if you take them, there's a giant erratic of Shat granite somewhere near Durham in Durham County. And that was explained away until this last century, as in the 20th century, as being one of the, it must have been moved by the biblical flood. Because the Victorians up to then had no other way to explain how such a huge rock could have been moved away from its own parent material area all the way over the Pennines and dumped in another county. So certainly, yeah, the glaciation was 19th century onwards.
Right. Well, if you can read it as a testimonial to your field courses, you'd be glad to read.
Thanks, Guy.
And somebody else has asked what kind of geomorphology caused the heather terrace on the back of Tryfan.
To be honest, it wasn't really geomorphology. That's more down to geology. Because when you get some, when you look up the mountain, there are definitely different types of rock. And I think you've got a complete change in rock there. Yeah, actually, to be fair, yeah, geomorphology will have helped, but so will weathering. So if you've had a harder rock down below and then a softer rock up above, the softer rock has been eroded and weathered further back. So if that's your original slope, the harder rocks remained where it is and the softer rocks being eroded back, which has then left this terrace, or what seemed like a terrace or step, on the slope of Tryfan.
Good, thank you. Right, any more before we wrap up? We're just about coming to the hour, so.
Oh, that's it, peaching home. Yep. Because they've got, if you go to the Assynt Field Centre along Knocken Crags, there's a fantastic little display, and they've actually got human-sized sculptures of those two geologists, but they've also got a modern geologist with an iPad in her hand, so she can data log things. And they are so realistic. My old dog, when we took her there, actually walked up to them and wagged her tail and tried to get them to throw a stick for her.
Well, perhaps you need to add that, the geologist's dog. Right, well, look, we're just coming up the hour now, and I think we should draw things to a close. Before I thank Helen formally, just let me remind you that our final talk of this season and the series organised by Deb Feeling will be on the Caper Cayley campaign. Here you see a screen in front of you by the project manager, Carolyn Robertson. And it's a pretty hot topic in this part of the world. So I hope you'll all join us by Zoom in the same way as tonight on that occasion. Donald, I think you've yet another talk to advertise. Here we go, by the John Muir Trust this time. A little different from rocks, but it sounds pretty interesting.
That one's in person.
Okay, and for those of you in NEMT members, the Kath is beavering away, or will be beavering away, I hope, next week on the magazine Mountain Views, which is due out next month. And those of you who subscribe will be receiving that in due course. So let me just wrap up this evening. A fascinating talk. You're quite right, Helen. Once you start being told about these things, you certainly look around you a lot more closely than one did before. Perhaps those of us getting on in years are very grateful to you for giving us a good excuse to stop and having a look around and not try and keep up with that fit young chap 100 yards ahead of us. It's been really entertaining, really educational, and we're very grateful to you for giving up your time and skills this evening. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you, Helen.